Thanks for joining us here on 9 News Plus. I'm Chris Bianchi. So now, amidst all the investigations that are kind of into former President Donald Trump specifically, but we've seen some investigations into current President Joe Biden as well as former Vice President Mike Pence. But perhaps the one that stands out with the most maybe legal ramifications out of all those may be the Georgia investigation into former President Donald Trump's attempts or alleged attempts to overturn the 2020 election. Prosecutors in Georgia have investigated former President Trump's role in the 2020 election and perhaps again trying to overturn those results in Georgia. And it appears they are getting close to rendering a possible recommendation for prosecution. So we're now joined by 9 News legal expert Whitney Traylor to assess the overall threat to former President Donald Trump. And Whitney, I guess I want to start things off by saying that something you've talked about frequently here has been that this Georgia investigation may be the one that holds the most hot water for the former president, right?
Right. We've talked about the various litigation or pending litigation. And yeah, I do believe that this Georgia case, the potential case in Fulton County, may be his greatest exposure. And I say that because, one, all of the evidence happened before us. All of the potentially incriminating acts happened in public on that phone call that everybody listened to on January 2nd of 2021, the call to Brad Raffensperger, the Secretary of State in Georgia, to try and find essentially more votes. And the quote that's really caught a lot of attention is when President Trump said, "All I want to do is this. I just want to find 11,780 votes, which is one more than we have." And so that statement is led to this special grand jury being convened to look into whether there were crimes committed related to trying to influence the election.
And it sounds like that the grand jury has issued the recommendation at this point, right?
Right. So this is a special grand jury. It's it hasn't been called often in Georgia, but it's certainly something that the DA can use. And so the district attorney in Fulton County, Fani Willis, she called together this special grand jury. They've been meeting since May. They were able to issue subpoenas and interview witnesses. They interviewed over 75 witnesses and gathered thousands of documents, and so they've now completed their investigation and they've submitted their report to DA Willis. And now the question is, they just had a hearing last week requesting that it be publicized. It was actually the district attorney, Fani Willis, who was fighting that, not wanting it to be public because her position was it could potentially affect the fairness of the trial for other possible defendants. So she's suggesting that based on the report, there's going to be multiple indictments with multiple defendants.
Yeah, and why do you say that there's that suggestion? What, and maybe in the legalese, seems clear to you in that?
Well, the fact that she's actually requesting in open court, in a hearing, that this not be made public. So the strong reason, and she said, I don't want to harm other defendants, the fairness of their trial. So in other words, if this special grand jury, if this information gets out and becomes public and then other defendants go to trial, that could impact the impartiality of their trial. So that's why it's suggesting that's the case. And she said a decision will be made imminently. So I would expect it to be this week or maybe next week even.
Okay, so you mentioned that what Trump said on the phone call makes it pretty clear what he wanted, but isn't there something with Georgia's state laws that makes it fairly clear? So what may make this a bit more hot water for former President Trump specifically is what's in the Georgia state law as well, in addition to what he said, correct?
Right. So these are state laws that he's being accused of.
Not federal, state, right?
Right. So attempting to influence an election, an elected official, violation of other state voter election laws, and his scheme to attempt to appoint an alternate slate of electors. And there was letters that went out. There were 16 people that signed, and I believe Rudy Giuliani was also one of those individuals that signed as a illegitimate slate of electors to try and vote for Trump, even though the state had went to Biden. And so the letters went out from the district attorney saying that potential charges may be coming for those 16 individuals as well.
What would the ramifications be? So let's say that there are going to be these charges brought forward. How serious would the consequences be if he's convicted?
Well, the consequences would be historical. This has never happened in terms of a former president being indicted. So that would be completely precedent setting. And then certainly what would happen, if there was a conviction, how do you serve a sentence as a former president? And then certainly that would impact his ability to run in the 2024 election. Now this is all new territory. There's a lot of theories out there, but if he is indicted, even charged, tried, convicted, any one of those steps would be historical.
What do we know about Fani Willis, who would be the Fulton County prosecutor who would bring forward these charges?
Right. So Fani Willis, I know her personally. She's we went to law school together. We went to Emory University School of Law. I won't say what year for her to protect her.
2015.
Yeah, something a little earlier than that. But I had several classes with her, including criminal procedure, and she was. I've seen her in her press conferences, and she's the same. Very tenacious, very sure of herself, very confident. But this is new territory for the country. It's certainly going to be new territory for her. So she's qualified. She's eminently qualified, very thorough, tenacious. Now, of course, the reporting is that she's a Democrat. President Trump has said this is all partisan, that she should be prosecuting violent criminals. But the counterpoint to that is we witnessed the potential crime being committed as a public, and there was an outcry to pursue that, and that's certainly what her job is. So this is new territory for everybody, and based on the most recent comments, I suspect that there will be indictments of multiple defendants. Whether or not that includes President Trump is, I'm going to be extremely interested in watching closely, because that will be
potentially historic, as you mentioned.
Yeah.
So you mentioned that former President Trump what he said is what perhaps got him in hot water. Isn't there a degree of subjectivity to all these things? What President Trump said is, I want to find 11,780 votes.
Yeah.
Which is one more than what we already have. Is that difficult to prosecute?
Yes, because certainly, and what's so interesting is if you look at Donald Trump's history, not only as president or in politics, but his business career, he has fought off lawsuits, and that's not unusual for a businessman, a legitimate business person, to be sued. That's part of doing business in many ways. But a lot of his lawsuits were very egregious claims, and he has a history and a pattern, and it's all public record, of fighting it off, putting resources out, and then eventually settling it. And when there's a non-disclosure, and essentially he's wearing people down. And in my practice, I've seen that the bigger party, the party with more resources, is able to push more in the litigation situation. Here, though, these are criminal charges. The DA's office has resources. They're not going to get wore down. So the reality is we could see this thing. There's only so much you can do in a criminal prosecution. There's a lot of filings, hearings, motions, which I would expect. I would expect this thing to be completely litigious until there's an actual trial, if there is. Now, of course, there could be a settlement. If there could be a plea. But knowing Donald Trump, he's actually criticized people for taking a plea and for taking the fifth. Saying, hey, if you know that you're not guilty, then go and proceed. And of course, it was he looked a little hypocritical because he took the fifth in several of these.
I was going to say that, yeah.
And he said his position was, well, this is partisan, this is political. He even said, District Attorney Willis, who is black, he said it was racism that she was going after him, and not unlike how he does things. He's throwing the kitchen sink at it, in the bully pulpit, and then in the litigation, he'll fight tenaciously, I would expect.
So walk us through, and I know I'm going to put you in a little hot water here.
Yeah.
Walk us through what you think happens over the course of the next few weeks and months, based on what you've known, based on what you've seen.
Right. It's just hard to even fathom this notion of a former president being indicted, but I think that is the case. I think there will be an indictment with President Trump and others, including Lindsey Graham. And Lindsey Graham also made a call to Brad Raffensperger and his staff, and his quote was, re-examining, he asked him about re-examining, quote, re-examining certain absentee ballots cast in Georgia in order to explore the possibility of a more favorable outcome for former President Donald Trump.
Okay, so we're talking about former current South Carolina Senator Lindsey Graham here. Can I be honest though, when I hear that, isn't that also a difficult thing to prosecute? You know, you're saying re-examining certain absentee ballots. He's just saying, again,
Right.
re-examine it. You know, there's nothing wrong with that, is there?
And you raise a great point, because you could be one of those jurors. And you have to remember, in a criminal prosecution, all it takes is one juror for a not guilty. And so to create...
and you're innocent until proven guilty, right? So the burden is on the prosecution.
And the burden is beyond a reasonable doubt. So here, if one says, well, that isn't exactly what I meant. And of course, if Lindsey Graham testified or Donald Trump testified, they're very smart. They're able to navigate.
Graham's a lawyer, I think, right?
Yeah, and
his background.
And right, and so they will be difficult to pin down. They're not going to admit anything, of course. So I think it would be a tough prosecution. That's one of the considerations that the district attorney has to determine is this a case? Do we have enough evidence? Can we win this? Can we prove this case beyond a reasonable doubt? Because the amount of resources that this case would take would be
enormous.
Enormous, because all of these Lindsey Graham, Rudy Giuliani, Donald Trump, all of their lawyers are going to be filing every motion possible. So it would be a tough litigation. So as I'm talking, I could see it. I definitely think there will be charges brought against multiple defendants. That I feel very comfortable saying. Whether or not it includes President Trump, I'm going to say 50-50. I wouldn't be surprised if it did. I wouldn't be surprised if it didn't. And part of the reason is, can you prove this?
Well, hearing the quotes, I will say that, though, with President Trump saying, find me 11,780 votes. Again, there's room for interpretation when you're talking about a jury. That sounds a lot clearer. I feel like, to me, again, just knowing as a layperson, not knowing the law, admittedly, I think the Lindsey Graham one, I think re-examining certain ballots, okay,
Right.
Easier to make that case. Find me 11,780 votes. It's pretty clear what he's intending, isn't it?
And your analysis is relevant, because this is what the jury is going to be made up of, people with varying educations and various backgrounds, but this is the analysis of, like, does this really mean X? Because there's both the mental state of the defendant and the actions that they take. The prosecution has it's called the mens rea and the actus reus. So they have to show that mindset. What was their intention? So you raise a great point that it's going to be difficult. Now, keep in mind, the call went on for over an hour. So there were multiple statements. And of course, the grand jury had the benefit of interviewing over 75 witnesses who had various capacities during that call. So together, right, that's where the district attorney has a benefit that we all don't have, because she has all this information, all of the summary of all of their investigations in terms of the evidence that they looked at and things like that. So we're basing it on things that were very public and very overt in a lot of ways, but there's so much more, because there'll be people who had conversations behind the scenes. What did it mean? So if the report is made public, that would be really interesting and would be very revealing, enlightening. You know, because I'm assuming the report is probably over 100 pages, I would assume.
Well, we'll have you back on when that report is either revealed publicly or not, when we find out.
There's indictments.
There's indictments, yeah. So either way, we'll have you back on, Whitney. But thanks so much for lending us a few minutes of your time. And again, the reason, just want to reemphasize for our viewers out there, the reason that we are specifically talking about this is that something that Whitney has specifically said may hold the most legal hot water for the former president. So it's just kind of want to outline for you that as this comes in the next few days, next few weeks, that this is what to expect. So with that said, Whitney, we appreciate the minutes of your time. Thanks for lending us your expertise here today.
Sure thing. Good to be here.